From medieval invasions and burning cities to satellites, smartphones, and global panic, Muggle history has constantly shaped the wizarding world. Every war, invention, and societal shift narrowed the space where magic could exist safely, forcing witches and wizards to adapt, retreat, and rewrite how they lived. Like the Norman conquest of England, 11th century. The Norman conquest rewrote England's political map in one decisive sweep. Historians still aren't sure if it was one guy named Norman who was just really good at fighting, or an army where everyone just happened to be named Norman. Regardless, wizarding families embedded in Muggle society were caught in the paperwork. Land was seized, titles reassigned, and loyalties reset overnight. Any magical household relying on old Anglo-Saxon protections suddenly found those agreements meaningless to new Norman rulers who were already suspicious of anyone aging too slowly or owning rooms that stayed locked for no reason. The flying around on broomsticks and making things explode with words didn't help either. For wizards, this event exposed a structural flaw. Muggle power changes quickly, violently, and with zero concern for magical continuity. Families were forced to abandon visible influence, quietly relocate, or conceal assets before attracting attention. This accelerated a shift away from public status toward isolation and concealment. Hidden estates, magically protected dwellings, and rural retreats became safer than castles and courts. The conquest taught an early lesson that wizarding society never forgot. Tying long-lived magical families to short-lived political regimes was less integration and more future inconvenience. Secrecy proved more reliable than loyalty. Oh, and never, ever, under any circumstances, trust anyone named Norman. The European witch hunts, 15th to 17th centuries. The European witch hunts were the first sustained Muggle panic that made open magical life impossible. As plagues spread and crops failed, Muggles blamed anything suspicious, including neighbors who owned cats or looked confident near candles. Actual witches and wizards were rarely killed, thanks to defensive magic, like flame-freezing charms, which turned executions into uncomfortable theater. The real danger was not death, it was attention. Meanwhile, fake witches and wizards burned just fine and were sometimes used for kindling when wood was scarce. Public accusations trained Muggles to scrutinize behavior, search for signs, and escalate fear rapidly. Wizards responded by reducing public magic, abandoning towns, and forming isolated communities well before secrecy became law. Even Quidditch had to adapt, relocating matches after too many Muggles noticed aggressive broom traffic overhead. The hunts permanently destroyed trust. Wizards learned that fear spreads faster than facts, and that coexistence collapses under pressure. By the late 17th century, secrecy was no longer optional. It was survival. The Salem witch trials, late 17th century. The Salem witch trials proved that Muggle paranoia, much like colonialism, could cross the Atlantic and immediately make things worse. Unlike Europe, North American magical communities were smaller, newer, and far less experienced at hiding. When accusations began in Massachusetts, several real witches and wizards lived nearby, surrounded by neighbors who had discovered the exciting new hobby of accusing everyone, as well as a penchant for setting things on fire, like the aforementioned accused. Most of the accused were innocent Muggles, no biggie, but the damage was still severe. The trials demonstrated how quickly fear could spiral when combined with religion, isolation, and bad legal procedures. For American wizarding society, Salem became the cautionary tale. The response was extreme and permanent. Magical authorities in North America enforced stricter secrecy laws than anywhere else in the world, banning cooperation with no-mages almost entirely. Ilvermorny expanded as a safe haven, and American wizarding culture became far more insular than its European counterpart. Salem didn't just frighten wizards, it rewrote how an entire continent handled secrecy. The Great Fire of London, 17th century. The Great Fire of London destroyed most of the city in a matter of days, and while Muggles blamed ovens and poor planning, as well as, fire, the wizarding world focused on damage control. London already contained concealed magical dwellings, protected alleyways, and long-established enchantments woven into the city's layout. Fire does not care about historical wards. Like a combustible gunslinger, it burns first and asks questions never. Wizarding buildings were not immune. Protective charms could resist heat and collapse to a point, but collapsing Muggle structures posed a different problem. Falling debris, shifting streets, and mass evacuations created constant exposure risks. Wizards were forced to reinforce concealment spells in real time, while Muggles wandered through streets that were suddenly rearranged. Entire magical access points had to be relocated or erased from collective memory. The fire also demonstrated a new problem: reconstruction. London was rebuilt quickly and differently. Streets were widened, districts reorganized, and records rewritten. Wizarding locations embedded in the old city could not simply reappear in the new one without explanation. This accelerated the practice of folding magical spaces into locations that could be permanently hidden, misdirected, or magically expanded without relying on stable Muggle geography. One such location was a blue police box that was bigger on the wait, that's a different franchise. The Great Fire reinforced a core wizarding principle. Natural disasters are manageable. Muggle rebuilding is not. Once Muggles start redesigning their cities, magic has to adapt or vanish quietly behind a wall that no longer exists. The Industrial Revolution, 18th to 19th centuries. The Industrial Revolution changed the rules of hiding. For centuries, magic stayed secret by being remote. Then, Muggles invented railways, factories, mines, and the unsettling habit of mapping everything. Suddenly, nowhere was truly out of the way anymore. As cities expanded and infrastructure spread, magical settlements found themselves uncomfortably close to rail lines, work camps, and curious surveyors who asked too many questions and wrote everything down. Creatures that once lived undisturbed were displaced. Dragon reserves, giant territories, and enchanted forests had to be concealed more aggressively or relocated entirely. Maybe that movie should have been called How to Hide Your Dragon. Okay, that was bad. But they can't all be winners. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures expanded, largely because Muggles would not stop building things where dangerous magic lived. Transportation became a constant threat. Trains cut through landscapes that had been safe for centuries. Wizards responded with large-scale Muggle-repelling charms, illusion spells, and geographic misdirection powerful enough to affect entire regions. Older concealment methods were no longer sufficient. The Industrial Revolution forced wizarding secrecy to evolve from passive hiding into active maintenance. The International Statute of Secrecy was updated because it had to be. Muggle progress was no longer slow or local. It was fast, documented, and extremely interested in what was under the next hill. World War I, 1914 to 1918. World War I did not involve wizard battalions charging across trenches. Largely because, 1, wizarding governments banned direct involvement, and 2, they would have flown instead. The war did, however, destabilize borders, governments, and communication networks across Europe, which created ideal conditions for magical activity to go unnoticed. When Muggle authorities are overwhelmed, they miss things. Wizards noticed that immediately. The conflict disrupted magical regulation in subtle but dangerous ways. Ministries struggled to track cross-border magical travel as passports, borders, and governments changed repeatedly. Dark artifacts moved more freely. Smuggling increased. Magical creatures displaced by bombing and trench warfare wandered into areas they absolutely should not have been. Have you seen the trouble a troll can get into wandering around downtown London? I promise you, it's not pretty. While wizards were not fighting in the war, they were constantly cleaning up around it. Most importantly, the chaos provided cover for Grindlewald. The instability allowed him to travel, recruit, and experiment with minimal oversight. With Muggles focused on survival, wizarding authorities were stretched thin, trying to enforce secrecy and monitor emerging threats at the same time. The war did not create Grindelwald, but it removed nearly every obstacle that might have stopped him early. The Great Depression, late 1920s to 1930s. The Great Depression proved that wizarding economies are not as independent as they like to pretend. When Muggle financial systems collapsed, magical communities, especially in North America, felt the shock almost immediately. Wizards relied on Muggle-produced goods, shared supply chains, and discrete employment more than secrecy laws admitted. In the United States, strict magical laws already banned cooperation between magical and non-magical citizens. When Muggle industries failed, wizards could not legally step in, trade openly, or stabilize resources. Shortages followed. Potion ingredients became scarce. Magical goods inflated in price. Smuggling and black market trading expanded rapidly as desperate families looked for ways around isolationist laws. The Depression also changed wizarding behavior. Wizards who quietly worked Muggle jobs were forced back into hidden communities as unemployment arose and scrutiny increased. Economic desperation heightened paranoia. Magical authorities worried that struggling Muggles might start noticing oddities they had previously ignored. While no laws were rewritten, attitudes hardened. The Great Depression reinforced the belief that Muggle crises spread unpredictably and that wizarding society absorbs the consequences, whether it wants to or not. Wizards learned that economic collapse does not need spells to cause damage. It only needs scarcity. World War II, 1939 to 1945. World War II is the most deeply entangled Muggle conflict in modern wizarding history. Global warfare created unprecedented destruction, mass displacement, and constant confusion. And it was no picnic for wizards either. These conditions made secrecy both harder to enforce and easier to hide within. When entire cities are evacuated or reduced to rubble, unexplained events blend in disturbingly well. This period shaped the next generation of dark wizards directly. Tom Riddle spent his childhood in a Muggle orphanage during wartime Britain, surrounded by fear, deprivation, and children who couldn't magic away their poop after they soiled themselves. That environment reinforced his belief that power and control were the only safeguards against vulnerability, and that indoor plumbing was a necessity, not a luxury. His rise coincides with the war's aftermath, when institutions were weakened and attention was divided. At the same time, a parallel wizarding conflict escalated across Europe. Dark ideology spread under the cover of Muggle chaos, with borders collapsing and magical enforcement struggling to keep pace. Secrecy became nearly impossible to police consistently. Explosions, blackouts, evacuations, and mass movement meant magical incidents could vanish into the noise of war without investigation. The International Statute of Secrecy was tested to its limits. Ministries focused on containment rather than prevention, prioritizing concealment over long-term solutions. World War II left two permanent marks on the wizarding world. It shaped Voldemort's worldview and forced magical governments to accept that large-scale Muggle violence creates ideal conditions for dark magic to grow unnoticed. The Blitz of London, 1940 to 1941. The Blitz was a concentrated stress test on magical London. Not to be confused with NFL Blitz, a game I played on the Nintendo 64 in the 90s. Sustained bombing campaigns reshaped entire neighborhoods night after night, forcing the Ministry of Magic to respond not to a single incident, but to continuous Muggle military action. Protective enchantments work well against spells. They are far less enthusiastic about collapsing buildings. Hidden magical locations across London required emergency reinforcement. Concealment charms had to be layered, strengthened, and adjusted again as streets vanished and landmarks disappeared. Wizards were not targeted, but they were constantly endangered by proximity. This message brought to you by bombs, the equal opportunity killer. Evacuations made the situation worse. Displaced Muggles wandered into unfamiliar areas, sometimes alarmingly close to magical access points. The Ministry increased patrols and rapid response teams, turning London into a city-wide secrecy operation. Every explosion risked revealing something that was never meant to be seen, like the contents of a human ribcage. They're called internal organs for a reason. The rise of mass Muggle media and recording technology. Mid to late 20th century. The rise of mass media quietly created one of the most persistent threats to magical secrecy. Photography, television, audio recording, and eventually home video turned ordinary Muggles into accidental archivists. Magical exposure no longer required a crowd. It only required someone holding a camera and a reason to press record. This forced the Ministry of Magic to shift from isolated incident management to continuous damage control. Memory charms, once reserved for rare emergencies, became routine tools. Entire departments expanded to intercept news stories, suppress footage, and replace magical explanations with accidents, weather events, or structural failures. The flying Ford Anglia, the Brockdale Bridge collapse, and Aunt Marge's inflation incident all demonstrate how quickly a magical mistake could become a broadcast problem. The issue is not just visibility, but permanence. A rumor fades. A recording does not. Wizards had to assure that any magical act performed near Muggles could be replayed, shared, and analyzed. This led to stricter enforcement around underage magic, tighter control of magical transport, and constant reminders to Muggle-born witches and wizards raised in camera-heavy environments. Mass media forced secrecy to become proactive rather than reactive. Wizards could no longer rely on witnesses forgetting. They had to prevent documentation entirely, which proved far harder than erasing memories after the fact. They also had to remember to record their spicy adult wizard content in a pensieve rather than on a video cassette, lest the Muggles accidentally find out what a Diagon Alley steamer is. The satellite and surveillance era, late 20th century. Just as wizards adapted to cameras at ground level, Muggles decided to put them in space. Satellites, radar systems, and aerial surveillance transformed secrecy from a social problem into a technical one. Wizards were no longer hiding from people. They were hiding from machines that never blinked and never forgot. This posed immediate risks to locations like Hogwarts, dragon reserves, and enchanted forests. Satellite imagery could capture land patterns, heat signatures, and unexplained structures. Traditional concealment charms were insufficient against automated observation. In response, wizarding governments developed large-scale enchantments designed to distort perception digitally. Magical locations were made to appear as empty terrain, natural weather patterns, or crop circles because, when all else fails, just say aliens did it. Urban surveillance added another layer. CCTV networks meant that even minor magical incidents in cities could be recorded without a human operator present. Countercharms were introduced to interfere with recording devices, corrupt footage, or render magical activity visually unremarkable. The French Revolution, late 18th century. The French Revolution introduced a problem wizarding society had not faced before: ideological violence aimed directly at inherited status. While the revolution targeted Muggle aristocracy, its underlying message, titles, bloodlines, and old power structures are illegitimate, was deeply uncomfortable for a magical culture built almost entirely on those concepts. Many European wizarding families mirrored the very systems being dismantled. Long-established pure-blood lineages owned land, controlled institutions, and relied on traditions that suddenly became politically dangerous. The magic ruling class was so out of touch that it's rumored they would occasionally respond to news of poor, struggling wizards with the phrase, "Let them drink butterbeer." Even though Muggles were not hunting wizards specifically, the climate of suspicion made any secretive, privileged group an obvious future target. Wizards did the sensible thing and stopped drawing attention to themselves. The revolution also destabilized continental magical governance. Ministries that had quietly aligned themselves with monarchies lost political cover overnight. Wizards who had relied on royal protection or informal influence within courts found themselves exposed. As borders shifted and governments collapsed, secrecy enforcement became inconsistent, forcing local magical communities to act independently. Perhaps most importantly, the revolution hardened wizarding attitudes towards Muggle political movements. Reform was no longer viewed as progress. It was viewed as volatility. European wizarding society became more conservative, more insular, and more committed to maintaining internal hierarchies without outside influence. The lesson absorbed was simple. Muggle ideology spreads faster than spells, and when it turns hostile to tradition, it destroys everything it touches first and asks questions later. The Victorian spiritualism craze. 19th century. Victorian spiritualism was a rare moment when Muggles did not fear magic, they actively went looking for it. Seances, mediums, spirit photography, and attempts to communicate with the dead became fashionable, respectable, and extremely enthusiastic. From a wizarding perspective, this was not progress. It was a containment breach waiting to happen. The problem was proximity. Ghosts are real. Magical echoes exist. Bigfoot is... okay, that one actually is a hoax. Certain phenomena spiritualists described were uncomfortably close to actual magical effects, even if most practitioners were frauds. Wizards faced a new risk: curious Muggles stumbling into genuine magical territory while thinking they were playing parlor games. The ministry responded by tightening restrictions on magical communication, spirit interaction, and public magical artifacts. Ghosts associated with wizarding locations were monitored more closely. Magical families were discouraged from engaging with curious Muggle groups, no matter how politely invited. The goal was not to correct misinformation. It was to prevent accidental confirmation. Spiritualism forced the wizarding world to confront a different kind of exposure. Fear creates mobs. Curiosity creates persistence. Unlike witch hunts, this movement did not burn itself out quickly. It lingered, spread, and asked questions. Wizards learned that secrecy is threatened just as much by fascination as by violence. And possibly more, because fascination doesn't come with pitchforks. It comes back every Thursday evening with notebooks. The rise of the internet and digital records. Late 20th to early 21st century. The internet solved a problem Muggles didn't realize they had: forgetting things. For the wizarding world, this was catastrophic. Before digital records, exposure could be managed. Witnesses forgot, newspapers moved on, physical photographs could be confiscated. The internet does none of those things and does them all at once. Magical secrecy now had to account for instant global sharing. Memory charms became largely useless against screenshots. The ministry could not obliviate a server. This forced a magic strategic shift. Wizards began prioritizing prevention over correction. Anti-recording charms were refined. Magical interface spells were designed to corrupt digital files rather than erase memories. In other words, that phishing scam your granddad fell for last week may have come directly from the Ministry of Magic. Certain magical incidents were deliberately allowed to remain online, buried under misinformation, hoaxes, and conspiracy theories. If everything looks fake, nothing stands out. The internet also changed risk assessment. Wizards could no longer assume exposure was local. A mistake in one country could become a global curiosity in minutes. Modern Muggle crisis events and mass panic. 21st century. Modern Muggle crises, terror attacks, natural disasters, infrastructure failures, mass evacuations, present a uniquely exhausting problem for wizarding authorities. Every large-scale emergency triggers the same question inside the Ministry of Magic. Was that us, or do we just need to clean around it? Coincidentally, this is the same question often asked by parents with IBS. Panic creates chaos, and chaos is dangerous for secrecy. Dementor activity can resemble sudden mass depression. Magical explosions look suspiciously like structural failures. See, I told you jet fuel couldn't melt steel beams. Dark wizard attacks blend easily into disasters already being reported. With phones, drones, live streams, and constant news coverage, even a single magical misfire can escalate quickly. Canon shows the Muggle Prime Minister being briefed precisely because magical incidents can overlap too closely with real-world crises. The Ministry now monitors Muggle emergencies not to intervene, but to ensure magic is not blamed, noticed, or accidentally filmed in the wrong context. Rapid response teams operate alongside disaster zones, quietly redirecting attention and reinforcing concealment. Modern crises taught the wizarding world an uncomfortable truth. The more chaotic Muggle society becomes, the harder secrecy is to maintain, and the easier it is for magic to hide inside the noise. Every emergency is both a risk and a shield, and that balance has to be managed constantly, because the world no longer pauses long enough for magic to clean up after itself. 16 Muggle events, centuries of pressure, one constant result: secrecy. But hiding didn't prevent conflict. It just pushed it out of sight. Next, all Wizarding Wars explained in detail.